I'm sure you've all heard people use language like this. For example, they go to the grocery store and they just see how expensive everything is, and they say something to the effect of, how do they expect us to live? How do they expect us to afford this? And they use the word they. I ask, who are they? Example, somebody will read something on the internet and they'll say that such and such is so good. It helps prevent cancer. And then say, well, they say you should eat this. Again, who are they? They'll say, oh, they're spying on us. Well, granted, we all have a microphone and a camera in our pocket, but still, who are they? Like, is they just this vague boogeyman? We don't really also use proper nouns sometimes. Because I think by using this generic term, they, it makes us feel as if someone's out to get us. That we are a victim. Who are they? And it becomes a game of us versus them. I don't know exactly who they are, but I know they're not good. I know that there's something bad out there. And I know if they don't think like I do, or they don't have the same ideology as I have, then they're bad. And it becomes a game of us versus them. They are the bad guys. Exactly who they are? Well, I don't know who they are exactly, but I can tell you that if they check these boxes, they're not good. Well, okay. Becomes a game of us versus them. And we see this in how much discord is being fostered in our lives, between, from politics to whatever you have it, there's a constant division and discord. We fall into this trap of us versus them. And we don't know all the particulars, but we know that there's bad people out there and they're trying to hurt us. Well, that may partially be true, but it also is good to know a little bit more on solid ground exactly why they're bad. But nonetheless, we fall into this trap of us versus them. In the first reading this morning, we encounter a guy that we should know. But he's given to us by a different name. His name is Saul. And who is Saul? We know his other name. What's his other name? Paul. He has his name changed from Saul to Paul after he encounters Christ. But if you notice, he's just arrived to Jerusalem and they're all afraid of him. Meaning the disciples are afraid of Saul. Why are they afraid of Saul? Because he's one of them. Who are they? The Pharisees, the chief priests, those who killed the Lord. And you know what Saul was known for doing? Persecuting Christians. They don't believe that he's changed. They're afraid of him. And if you know the Acts of the Apostles, if you flip back a chapter or two, we encounter this guy named Stephen. The disciples needed some help, so they recruited some folks to help them. They're called the first deacons. Stephen couldn't keep his mouth shut and said what was true and got himself into some trouble. And guess what happened to Stephen? He got killed. He got martyred. And guess who just so happened to be part of the group that martyred him? Saul. Paul. He was part of that group. They killed Stephen. And so, rightfully so, many of the disciples have some strong reservations about this dude named Saul. Has he really changed? Isn't he one of them? We can't trust him, can we? They're afraid. We see Barnabas. Barnabas, however, sees things slightly differently. Barnabas saw how in Damascus, Saul had spoken boldly out in the name of Jesus. And Saul sees something in Barnabas sees something in Saul that is different. And so he goes up to the other disciples and he goes to bat for him. And he says, this guy is different. And he wants to be on our side. He wants to spread the good news. He is insanely smart. And he knows how to deal with these Hellenists, meaning those Jewish people who are well familiarized in Greek culture and have a certain intellectual training. He's really good at dealing with the Hellenists. But think about it. They all know the death of Stephen's probably still relatively fresh on their mind. They know what Saul's infamous for, killing Christians. Why should we trust him? If we flip back a few weeks ago, we met this dude named Thomas. And Thomas, he's a big doubter. The Acts of the Apostles is silent on what Thomas thinks on this. But I think we can kind of gather. Put yourself in Thomas's shoes, or sandals at this point. He probably thinks, this guy Saul, you can't trust him. He's one of them. He hasn't changed. Thomas is infamous for being a negative Nancy and not really being the optimist. He probably does not have a very high opinion at this point of Saul. Saul's going to have to prove himself. So if you notice, when they gather together, they send him away. They're like, okay, fine. Saul, I cautiously believe that you've changed. But just in case you haven't, we're going to send you far away. If you want to preach the good news, that's great. But we're going to, get you a little away from us, so just in case you want to kill us too. So where do they send him? Well, he goes all around the region. We know where he goes. We read these letters, right? He goes to Corinth. He goes to Galatia. He goes to Ephesus. He goes to all of these places. You know what he does? He preaches the good news, and he converts thousands of people. He establishes churches in these places. And we see that the conversion of Paul that happened when he was blinded by the Lord and he fell off the horse changed him. But did it change him totally? Was Paul suddenly sinless? Did he not have his flaws? No. But did it change him enough that his life was drastically on a different path? Absolutely. Up front, is that hard to believe? Sure. Is it easier to identify him with the people that he was associated with? Yes. In the beginning, he was just one of them. And rightfully so. They should have been cautious of the people who were trying to kill them. But were they open to the fact that Paul could change? And in some ways, Paul, he still struggled with himself. Paul was extremely smart. He was sharp of the tongue. He had no problem telling you off. And he was the smartest person in the room. And he often walked around, he's depicted, in statues carrying what? A sword. Don't mess with him. That's what Paul was. In the letter to the Corinthians, when Paul says, love is kind, love is patient, you know who wasn't very kind all the time? Paul. And you know who wasn't patient? Paul. In his letters, when he tells them that he wants them to do something, Paul pretty much expects for them to do it right there and then. Paul's not afraid to tell people off. Galatians chapter 3, verse 1 is what? You stupid Galatians. You Judaizers. You are saying one thing, but you're doing something else. That's a direct quote. Paul was not afraid. Paul had a strong personality. But was Paul different? Yes. Are we willing to believe that encountering Christ is enough for us to change? Yes. Does it mean we're instantly perfect? No. But can we see the individual being detached from the group? Where we can see the individual soul despite the others that they're associated with or the boxes that we've placed them in. Us versus them mentality can get real tiring after a while. We feel like everyone's out to get us, and we don't know who to trust. And I'm sure the disciples had a taste of that right there and then when they were seeing their peers being martyred and killed. They don't know who to trust. But Saul, he arrived after having this conversion, after seeing the Lord, and he was able to speak boldly on behalf of Christ. And he was different. He no longer was one of them. Rather, he was a disciple of the Lord. And we have to keep that in mind when we are constantly dealing with the polemics of our lives. We have to be able to accept the fact that people can change despite the fact that all of their faults may not immediately fade away. Christ can change us. Seeing the Lord and having that encounter can change us. But that doesn't mean that we're perfect overnight. And that doesn't mean that there isn't a certain burden upon us, a certain duty upon us to have to show others. And how do we show others? By proclaiming the gospel. And is that not what Paul exactly did? He went out to all of these places, and he spoke to people, and he preached the good news to them, and he changed them. So if we want to prove to others that we ourselves have changed, despite the many faults that we may still carry along with us, it's that we can preach the life, death, and resurrection of Christ and know that other people can change too. Again, that doesn't mean they're going to be perfect. That doesn't mean everything they do is suddenly going to be miraculous. But it means that they're different. And it means that they're detached from being part of them. They're no longer the enemy. We may have to work to be on the same team, but they are no longer the enemy. Being us versus them is exhausting. And it is only through the transformative power of Christ that we can be changed.